Hello and welcome. I'm Emilie Hardman, Head of Archives and Digital Strategy here at the Center for Creative Photography, in conversation today with the wonderful Barbara Alper. Barbara was born in Detroit, Michigan. She holds a BA in social work from Michigan State University and subsequently studied with renowned photographers Harold Feinstein and Lisette Medell at the MIT Creative Photo Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her work has been exhibited widely in North America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. She has published extensively with long-term clients, including such prestigious publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, Time Magazine, and Business Week. Her photographs are held in major public and private collections all around the world, including the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Brooklyn Museum, International Center for Photography in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the New York Public Library, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She lives and works in New York City and is here today to share some of her work and thoughts about her career with us. Barbara.
Hey, well, thanks, Emilie. It's really an honor to be here with you, and I appreciate your inviting me for making this presentation. And I've been reviewing my different series, which resulted really from my love of photography and my curiosity about human nature and the world we inhabit. I always liked taking pictures and got my first camera at the age of 7 by selling Christmas cards. And this is me with that camera. I photographed family and travels, but I never even thought that it could be anything more than that, and never crossed my mind that it would be an art form and even a career. As you mentioned, I studied social work, and it wasn't until I moved to Boston and I had friends who were artists and photographers that it dawned on me that I can do that. So I'll be showing you an overview of my images from 1976 to the present. And these include various themes and topics such as street photography, celebrities, protests, the beach, underwater, sex clubs, and the Gulf War. And this is a photo of me with my instructor at MIT, Peter Layton. When I had decided that I wanted to be a photographer full-time, I took a couple of basic courses. Then I went up to MIT's Creative Photo Lab with a box of prints, and they allowed me to audit the course for a year. I wasn't interested in getting, college credits. I didn't need that. I just wanted the experience. After I finished auditing the class, I decided that I'd be earning my living as a photographer and that I wanted to do editorial work and not advertising. I started working for the weekly alternative newspaper, the Boston Phoenix, and these first set of images I did for them. I enjoyed working for them because of the more quirky type of assignments I get. Also, I felt they respected the image more so than the daily newspaper that might just need a photo to fill a space on the page. Got to photograph Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then I had this assignment to photograph the sword swallower, Captain Don Leslie, and his wife. Before he started, his wife held up an X-ray showing the sword down his throat, and in preparation for this, he took a swig from his bottle of booze that he kept nearby. Just an interesting aside. And Lou Reed. Now, I always carried my camera with me and shot everything and anything. Over the last year, I've been working with an editor, curator, going through all my work, starting with contact sheets at the beginning of my career in 1976. And we're discovering long forgotten images, including this one that we found on my 64th roll of film taken on a visit to New York City. It's another early New York image, which I'll tell you a bit more about later in our discussion. And I happened on this couple in this setting in the subway station. So once I moved to New York in 1979, I started working for different publications, including American Lawyer, LA Times, and then later a long relationship with the New York Times and others. I shot Spike Lee for the LA Times, and I shot other celebrities who either lived in New York or were passing through New York, including young Daniel Day-Lewis when he was promoting his movie My Left Foot, and Gloria Steinem in her home. Actually, this was shot for a French magazine called L'Express. This is a photo of Harvey and Bob Weinstein taken in their offices in 1989. When the scandal about Harvey broke in the news, luckily this one and a few others from the shoot were already with Getty Archives. And they ended up being the main images used around the world to illustrate the scandal. I started working for the New York Times in '94, and I primarily did features, lifestyle, portraits, fashion, and food. It was a good variety of work. Lifestyle images. This was from a New York Times shoot about illegal ownership of exotic pets. And this iguana and his friend were housed in a guitar store in Manhattan. And there were the comedian Joan Rivers at an event that she hosted. And then I ended up becoming the New York Times primary food photographer for their food section, something that early on I would never have imagined I'd be doing. But honestly, it's all photography. It's all about solving a puzzle, taking the various elements for the image and putting them together in such a way that creates a satisfying image for me. And I covered all sorts of events. This one was by the lighting designer, Ingo Moore. And I also shot weddings for the Vows column. On 9/11, Times Square was empty. Now, my inclination in general is to run away from danger and not towards it. So I really had no interest in rushing down to ground zero after the attacks happened. So I ended up for that day and over the next several weeks photographing other stories for the Times that illustrated how these attacks affected people and how life was affected by it. A couple of weeks after the attack, I was down near ground zero and saw these children in gas masks. And I was taken by it and asked the nanny if it would be okay for me to take their photo, and she agreed. Now, I've always shot a variety of things on TV. And when the Gulf War began in 1991, I decided I was going to shoot off of television. And I started changing channels. And when I got to this French news station called Entendu, and they were showing the images with subtitles, as they were translating it for the American audience, I knew that this told the story in a way better than I could just on my own. And the captions were amazing. They really tell the story. And I came to believe that the person who was doing these translations had to have been subversive. We would never see anything like this on any of our US stations. The series was exhibited at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1995, part of an exhibition called War Works, Women Photographing War. And it was popular everywhere outside of the United States. For the life of me, I couldn't get anyone interested in either publishing it or exhibiting the work, not for several years anyway. Lehigh University was the only one who showed it many years later. And really, it's meant to be a commentary about war and how it's presented to us. And it's not just about this one war in particular. And for whatever reason, galleries found it hard to get that concept. But I still have hope. So over the years, way from the beginning of when I photographed, I've covered demonstrations and protests. I've always been interested in social causes, including the fight for legal abortions, starting in the late 70s. And sadly, here we are today, going backwards 50 years with these rights once again being taken away. And it's kind of hard for me to believe that we're still fighting for these rights. Gay rights is another important issue, and I feel that it's important to also cover both sides of the story. So as you can see in these two images side by side are the protesters walking in the street, and this was from the early 80s when AIDS was a huge issue. And on the right side were the protesters and the homophobic ones who were there during the Pride Parade opposite. They were stationed behind a barricade. And it tells the complete story. And then I would go down to the end of the parade, Christopher Street, where people would gather, and it was fun, it was beautiful, it was loving, and I enjoyed capturing their joy as well. I started this series, Sex Play, back in 1981. The first of these here were taken at Chippendales starting in 1983. I enjoyed watching women's reactions as much as or more than the dancers themselves. And I'll tell you a bit more about my experience doing it. I went, when we were in conversation later, but I went back over the years several times. I used a small camera. I was somewhat inconspicuous, and no one stopped me. Then, starting in 1981, I was invited by the photographer Charlie Gatewood to a party that he was giving at the Hellfire Club in New York. And he told me I could bring my camera and that I should. So I did. And this was the first time I'd been to a club, anything like this, and witnessing S&M behavior. But I seemed to grasp what was going on and knew how to photograph it. So over the years following, there were parties going on around town, and I would hear about them, and I was allowed to photograph at them. In 1995, I was invited to photograph a large party in London called the Safer Planet Sex Ball. And that's where this and this image were taken. There's a lot more to this series than I can present here today. And when I traveled, I would photograph, and this was taken in Bangkok, Thailand, at clubs along Pat Pong Road. During the same period that I was doing the previous series, I was also photographing at Rockaway Beach starting in 1981. And I had a roll of infrared film that in my refrigerator that'd been there for years, and I decided, why not try it at the beach? And from once I developed the first roll, I knew that that was how I wanted to photograph it from then on. So every summer for at least the next 10 years, I went back to the same section of the beach, beach 123rd Street. And this is a photo of Lois at the beach, one of my most famous images, and it's included in several collections, including the ICP in New York. And I began by photographing on the beach, then slowly made my way into the water and then underwater. People got to know me by going back every summer, and they'd say, oh yeah, you're that photographer lady who was here last year. So it was very friendly and comfortable, and a very nice community that I like working with. Once I got an underwater camera and went underwater with it, I knew I wanted to do more. And that led me to my next series, Sea Samba, which began in Hawaii about in 1991 at Hanauma Bay in Oahu. I decided I wanted to primarily shoot it in black and white to not be distracted by the color and allowing the viewer to focus on the subject instead, which is people interacting with another species in an environment that's their territory, not ours. And I liked watching people were somewhat oblivious to what was going on around them. Anyway, having said that I wanted to primarily shoot in black and white, I just also decided that I didn't want to completely leave out color, so I alternated. Then one day, after seeing a dolphin up close at Sea Life Park in Oahu, I knew I had to photograph them. And that was just the beginning of years photographing dolphins, manatees, and whales, all in the wild. And this image on the left of the dolphin was the first time I'd photographed them. And it was at a location in Honduras where in fact they had dolphins in captivity. But after that experience, I decided I was only going to shoot in the wild after that. And I found a group out of Florida that did liveaboard trips for a week to the Bahamas, where we would wait for dolphins to come around, and then we'd see if they wanted to swim with us or not. And if they did, then we would go in and join them and swim around pretty much until they chose not to swim with us anymore and they left. And I did this for many years. I'd go at least once every summer. Sometimes I'd go twice, which was just an absolutely amazing experience. And I loved it. And that's the end of this part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, Barbara. Really lovely to see all those great images and hear the stories behind them. I had some questions and conversation just to engage you and hear more about your work and career. You know, we saw that your earliest work as a photojournalist was as a freelancer at the Boston Phoenix, and for about 40 years, the Phoenix was disseminating images of life that weren't really circulating anywhere else, and they covered a lot of trailblazing stories. You know, how do you think about that weekly framework as an entry point for your work? Do you think it shaped you or your photographic practices in any way?
Well, it was a great place for me to start my career, first off. We had common sensibilities. They liked my style, and I liked how they used photos. It was a great experience, even though it hardly paid anything. I shot a wide variety of assignments, including football, hockey, and music, and always on a tight deadline. I had to rush home. I had a darkroom in my apartment, develop the film, process it, make the prints, and bring them into the paper by the next morning. So it taught me discipline and I learned what this kind of work entailed, and I loved it. I loved the variety, and every shoot was a challenge. to make the best image that I could. And I'd never know what I'd be walking into. And that's really what editorial work is about. And it's having been doing this for as long as I have, it was obviously the right choice for me. It came easily, and I was working regularly very quickly. So moving to New York was much harder, but I can talk more about that. Because I thought that having a portfolio from Boston would make it easy getting jobs here, but that's not how it worked. Anyway.
Yeah, New York does not specialize in easy.
No, it wasn't easy. And a friend had said, excuse me, she said, oh, it can take you up to 7 years. I was like, 7 years? What? No, that can't be. It's not gonna take me 7 years, but in fact, that's pretty much what happened. But getting back to Boston and covering different sorts of stories, this was one that I covered called, this place is Silresum Chemical Corp. They went bankrupt and they left barrels of toxic chemicals, exploding toxic chemicals. And they were exploding from drums and seriously contaminating the soil. Had this occurred now, I probably would have had to wear a hazmat suit and shoe protectors. Instead, afterwards, I was told I might want to throw my shoes out. But in regards to working for the Boston Phoenix, in a short time, I became their primary photographer after the photo editor, who was expected to do most of the shoots. And when he was out of town, I'd fill in for him. So it was the best experience I could possibly have gotten.
Bit about kind of establishing yourself as a New York-based photographer. You know, how distinct was it to shift from that ground of working in Boston to establishing yourself and building up your practice in New York?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, it took 7 years to really get started. But that in that 7-year period, it gave me time to go and do the other projects, like starting at Rockaway Beach, or even the Sex Play series. All of those began in '81, and I didn't really get a good stream of work going until later in the '80s. I really enjoyed the variety and the challenge, and how do I make the most compelling image that I can make. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but and I never know what I'll be walking into. Every time was new. When I first began in New York, I was working for an American lawyer. That brought me to every law firm in the city. So it was a way of getting around and getting to know people. In this situation with Harvey and Bob Weinstein, I walked into their offices and I saw them right in front of me at the end of the hall where I came in. And before the shoot even formally started, I was in the offices setting one light up in one room and one light up in the other room, and took the picture while they continued what they were doing, and they didn't pay any attention to me. And then after that, when I was done, I introduced myself, and that's when the official shoot began.
Yeah,
But
such a great story.
but how was it as far as getting started in New York? As I said, Boston was easy. I came to New York with a misconception that since I already had a portfolio of work that I'd created in Boston, it would be easy. Anyway, but as I mentioned, I still kept shooting. I was doing street photography and I was working on personal projects. And I was also still supplying images to my stock agency, Stock Boston. And I started working with them pretty much right at the beginning of my career. So that was, that continued. And then actually, once I started working more full time, I didn't have as much free time to work on personal projects. But over the years, my career seems to have alternated between concentrating on jobs or concentrating on personal work. And as far as how New York City was different, it was fun to explore a new city, and everything is new. So no matter where I went and what I saw, there was a picture to be made. Over time, things have changed. It's not as easy as it was shooting randomly in the streets. Now that everyone has a camera with them, their phone, for example, they become more aware of being photographed and at the same time more wary of it. So they might say, hey, what are you shooting this for and why? And I'll say, well, I'm shooting it for me, which was the truth. That's what I was attracted to, whatever it was in front of me that I wanted to make an image of, without any specific end use in mind. So let's see, what else would you?
I mean, it's really, it is interesting to see that shift kind of in street photography, the changes of awareness and availability of, phones and, just how readily people are sort of captured in images on the street.
And, different from street photography, number one, the basic thing is I love taking pictures, period. It could be people, it can be sex scenes, it can be underwater, it can be kids playing on the street. I just love the act of taking and making photos. So even in doing celebrity portraits, I liked meeting the people, and over time, I became more comfortable with them and with myself interacting with them. I learned ultimately that we're all just people, bottom line. And yeah, I photographed Sting, I photographed Helen Hayes, Spike Lee, the actor Sam Waterston, to name a few. And every situation is different. And some people are easier to work with than others. With Sting, I had 10 minutes to do the shoot, and that I had to set up my camera, set up my light very quickly, and be done with it in 10 minutes because he was in a recording session. And also those situations are more controlled, where I set up lights. I had to control it, whereas on the street, I'm the observer. So that's kind of explains the difference in the two. But ultimately, it's about making pictures and making pictures that I like.
We're looking at, well, we were just looking at one of the New York Times photographs that you did on assignment, and you know, you're working at the Times in the 90s. Things are changing so fast, culturally, socially, you know, all these things, but also with technology. I was really interested in how new tools and technology were kind of coming into play in your work.
So, you know, to begin with, I never had really wanted to or intended to work for a daily newspaper. I didn't want to be on call 24/7, or the phrase I would use, sleep with a beeper.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1994, after working on the Gulf Channel, sort of my regular clients had kind of disappeared, and I needed to find work. So a freelance editor friend of mine introduced me to a couple of section editors, very specific editors at the New York Times that she thought I would click with, and I did that and got my first assignment, which ended up running half page on the cover of the city section, which made for a very good beginning with them. It was slow at first, but then over a short period of time, I became one of a handful of regular freelancers, sometimes working every day. And I'd get called by the editors, the photo editors directly, or if they were going through the assignment desk, they would ask for me. I liked the variety of lifestyle, imagery, food, fashion, runways, events, and bows. I wasn't a hard news photographer. And, you know, fashion, that was my love-hate relationship. I liked the fashions. I hated the way we were treated like cattle. That's a whole other discussion we can have. It wasn't very pleasant. There would sometimes be fights that would break out on the bleachers where we were all crammed together with exactly the amount of space that our bodies took up and no more, in a very uncomfortable situation. But nevertheless, it was still exciting and fun. And with food, I was my own stylist, or I'd work with a chef. I wasn't working with big studio lights, and I was shooting everything on location. But I got to work with the best chefs in New York City, and you got to taste some absolutely amazing food. So the problem with working with the Times, and I'll get to the whole technology thing, but the problem with working for the Times was that it took over my life, and it really became my life. Any plans that I made were made with the contingency that I might have to cancel if a job comes in, because you never turn down a job, or you don't turn jobs down on any kind of regular basis, or they'll not be calling anymore. Now, when I started working for them in 1994, we were shooting black and white film. So I would bring the film in, they would process it. Then after a couple of years, we switched to color negative. And this image here is the wall that was the outside wall of my darkroom. And I had a homosote board that I would pin these strips up onto. And these strips were, I call them film strips, and they document the various jobs that I did for the Times over 10 years. And since I was getting contact sheets made, I decided to make these prints for myself as a record. Now, what they were intended for is the editors would take the strip of film and put it across a machine that then projected images onto a monitor. And next to the monitor was this other machine that when they hit a button, it would print out the image on what was like fax paper. And then they could take those images as reference for the layout for their articles. So I decided that since I wasn't getting contact sheets made, these, I was making them for myself pretty much to have a record of what I was shooting. But then after 2000, we were forced to switch to digital. And I strongly resisted, but if I was going to be shooting for the New York Times, or actually for anyone, any editorial work, I had to switch to digital. And I didn't like the equipment was bigger and heavier, and then there was the learning curve, which was a bit torturous. But in any case, this is a close-up sampling the variety of work I got. On the left are actually the New York Times sent me to photograph the dresser for the Chippendales dancers. And on the right is the Japanese architect who did the redesign of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So when we switched to digital, initially we still had to go into the office, but then we could process process the digital images at home and transmit them. And then I no longer needed a beeper because then we switched to cell phones.
Yeah, it's so interesting how quickly those pieces of technology and just things we take for granted change. Those are amazing. I'd never seen those before. And yeah, so as much as technology is changing, the social and political landscape is too in this time that you're working. And you've done so much protest photography throughout the course of your career. How do you think documenting protests has been different from other kinds of work that you've done? And how has it changed for you over time?
So I wouldn't say that it's different. It's just another form of street photography. I'm out there to cover an event, and I'm open to pretty much whatever might happen and whatever I'm going to see, because again, I never know what's going to be. I'm not doing these on assignment. I'm doing them for myself. So there are no, job guidelines that I have. But I try to, find the best spot to shoot from. I walk with the protesters. Sometimes I end up having to walk backwards so that I can be facing them as they're coming towards me with their various signs. And essentially I'm in the mix, I'm part of it. And I also like photographing the people on the sidelines who are protesting the protesters, and capturing their expressions. And I think it's good to show all sides of the story, capturing their energy, the excitement, the joy. And then when I'm doing the pro-choice marches, the anger and the energy behind the message that people are trying to get across. Early on, there was easier access into the parades. Now with with stricter security, there are more barricades. The police have gotten tighter about controlling how you enter the parade, where you leave. So it's gotten a bit harder, but again, once I'm part of it, then I'm I stick with it. So another thing, some of these pictures have been with the Getty Archive. And for example, this one on the left about AIDS and needing research, that picture has been used repeatedly over the years. And in fact, recently it was used in Biden's 2020 presidential campaign. And I don't know in advance what's being used. And I was watching the shows and the ads come up, and there was my photograph being used, which was very positive for me to see how the message was coming out and coming across.
Oh, I know you work with Getty a lot, and your images can get picked up kind of at any time, right? For any reason. How do you think about the way that they might be used, or like what are your concerns or like hopes in terms of seeing them put into the public?
So one thing, I never know how an image is going to get used. I don't know until I see a sales report, or I get a Google alert saying particular images are used in, in this newspaper, in Forbes magazine, or in some other illustration. There's an understanding we have. It's not a formal understanding, but they're not going to have let my pictures be used in a negative fashion. So like any of my gay pride or pro-choice are not going to be sold with to go with a negative message about that. So, I can't think about how an image might get used when I'm shooting, because that would interfere with my process and with my being, shooting in the moment. This image I shot early on in the 70s, and last year I opened up the Sunday New York Times to find it was used as a promotion for the Tribeca Festival, which is very exciting. I had no idea that this was happening until I saw it. So I was, to say mildly, I was thrilled. It was exciting. It was shown all over the place, and that was great to see. Oftentimes the pictures are used for, little websites and little nothing stuff. But in this instance, it was great. Also, Chippendales. That became a huge story a couple of years ago. Who knew that this would be? But I was part of a group of women photographers who were invited to one of the opening nights of the club in New York. And I brought my small Olympus XA clamshell camera, and no one noticed. But friends of mine who brought their bigger equipment with big flashes were stopped and told they had to put their cameras away. So I went back many times over the next several years to photograph at the club. I enjoyed watching the performers, but more I really liked watching women's expressions and the flirting and the reversal of roles. Men were now being treated as sex objects, finally balancing the equation, if you will.
The Chippendales story is a pretty wild ride, but as dark as it gets, it's all pretty much kind of light, good fun. And the work you were doing then in the more underground, harder edged sex clubs, those images really ended up causing like international scandal. You talk a little bit about that experience?
Oh yeah, definitely. But also just to fill in, the Chippendales pictures, there have been 2 documentary films made recently, The Curse of the Chippendales and The Chippendale Murders. And both of those ended up coming to me for photos, which they also used some that were on Getty's website. So that was also, had I not been with Getty, they wouldn't have known about the images. So this picture you bring up, I think it was in 93, 94, I was invited by a British gallery to send them some photos that they were considering exhibiting. So I shipped off 1 print and a sheet of 20 slides by FedEx, and it was intercepted by British Customs. And a week or so later, I received a letter from Customs saying the work had been seized. It was called pornographic. And if I didn't protest it, that they would destroy the work, which upset me greatly. And I thought, no, I don't want to do this. Don't want to have that happen. Plus, I was concerned about what repercussions there might be in the long term. If I were to go to England and have the images with me, might my work be intercepted? Might I be on some kind of a list or something? So anyway, I did some research. I was given the name of a lawyer that I might contact, and I did, and they were interested in representing me pro bono. And the name of the firm, coincidentally, was called Stevens Innocent. And I had heard that they represented Princess Di. Anyway, the work, 20 of my images were purchased by the New York Public Library. And prior to, and I got in touch with them, and they had wrote a letter talking about the artistic and sociological and historical value of the work. And I also reached out to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, who also had purchased some of the images for their collection. And they wrote a letter as well. And with these letters, it kind of gave the customs people a way of viewing the images. And with that, they allowed the pictures into the country, and I won the case. Great success.
Yeah, love to hear stories about librarians protecting art.
It was amazing. Yeah. It was really amazing. Every curator at the library signed the letter. It's phenomenal.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about some of your personal projects before we wrap up here. The Sea Samba and the Rockaway Beach, those are really dear to you and very different from the rest of the work that you were doing.
So honestly, these projects come from my life interests. Mm-hmm. So I had for years gone to Rockaway Beach and been photographing. And then as I mentioned earlier, when I started shooting with infrared film, I realized that this kind of gave me a direction to go in and work on the project. And kind of one thing leads to another. The same as I went into the water at Rockaway Beach, and then I went underwater, and then that led me to Sea Samba. So it was, shooting Sea Samba was interesting working underwater with dolphins and with people and trying to fit into their world, which is quite a challenge. And I have only one moment to get an image. Everything, including me, is moving. And it will never be repeated the same way twice. So that was quite challenging. And over this last year, working with an editor has been absolutely incredible. I got so lucky to have an editor say on their own that they wanted to come and go over all of my work. It was, what a gift. It was something I could never have imagined or never have asked for. And I feel so lucky to have been given this gift. And in the process, we're discovering and uncovering images long forgotten. And that's really exciting. And we'll see where this leads. I'm aiming to publish a book or two and exhibitions. At the moment, we've gone through pretty much all of my black and white, and I've had scanned over 2,000 images. And we're now starting with my color slides, and that will add on easily several hundred or more to the collection, and then the edit will begin, further edit, narrow it all down and make sense of all of it together. It's a great time. It's odd looking back at my work, but it also confirms that I obviously made the right choice in my career direction.
Definitely, yeah, and we've seen that today. Thank you so much for, kind of walking us through what almost serves as like a little glimpse into your archive and your whole history of work. It's been wonderful to see these images and hear behind the scenes with you. Thanks so much for your time.
Emily, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. You've been terrific. Thank you.
Happy to, and what a great way to go out. I love the humor and the sense of place in your work always. It's really wonderful to see.
Thank you.
Thank you.